Okay, so we're going to do a brief panel where we will introduce the Gender and Resilience Framework and give a little bit of background, and then the majority of it will be question and answer. After that, we will do a little bit of an interactive exercise, so you're not going to be sitting and listening long. Then we'll have a coffee break, and then we'll do some small group work. So with that, I'd like to introduce the panel. Coming to us from Arizona, right?
Yep.
Yep. Okay, coming to us from Arizona on the video screen here is Lori Starr. She's a strategic learning advisor for the top program with Save the Children, now also consulting, right? No, no longer consulting, formerly with Save the Children. Is that right?
Yeah, no longer consulting, full-time with TOP.
Okay. Okay, so you can't engage her anymore. Very sad for me. Big loss for those of us, but great win for Save. Okay, so that's Lori. Then here we have Mara Russell, the Director of Food Security and Resilience at CARE, who is also one of the working group co-chairs currently and has been for about 18 months. Is that about right? Yes. Yes, okay. Next to Mara is Audrey Anderson, who is the Director of the BRIDGE program, which is a specialized program funded by the Margaret and Cargill Philanthropies that is focused specifically on integrating gender and resilience across a portfolio of programs at Mercy Corps. She's also the other current co-chair of the Gender and Resilience Working Group for the last 18 months or so, right? And then Dorcas Robinson, who's the co-director of the Resilience Measurement, Evidence, and Learning Community of Practice. Thanks for joining me today. Okay, so I think we're going to start with Lori. She's going to introduce the background of the framework and the history to date, and then we will switch to the panel. Audrey's going to give us an overview of the framework, and then we'll have a few Q&A discussions. Take it away, Lori.
Okay, thank you so much, Susie, and good morning, everyone. I wish I was in the room. The background on the framework, as Christy mentioned, it sprang from discussions among members in the Gender and Resilience Working Group. There was this a collective recognition, I guess, that even though practitioners are increasingly collecting a solid body of evidence related to gender, it is not yet strongly integrated in resilience analysis. And many of us believed that, additionally, discussions about how to strengthen the 3 resilience capacities, they're advancing, and the measurement techniques are advancing, but they still feel fairly gender blind. Same is true for research around resilience response and the use of resilience capacities. And to me, this is the crux of gender and resilience dynamics, because there are so many well-documented gender inequities that could potentially influence the extent to which different genders of different ages can use the resilience capacities that are in place. Yet it's not yet common for most of the resilience research to capture data that helps us understand these dynamics. So the Gender and Resilience Working Group agreed that the development community of practice really needed to double up efforts to understand where these gendered gaps are when we break down the various elements of resilience frameworks, whichever resilience framework we're using. As Christy Tabai mentioned, Mara Russell was really the firebrand. She came to the Gender and Resilience Working Group in late 2016, and from the get-go was, we need a framework, we need a framework, we need a framework. Together with Audrey, who joined soon after, the women have just continuously devoted effort to ensuring that this idea was kept alive. There have been a diversity of folks, really contributing as much as they could, and then as competing responsibilities take over, other folks step up, and it has been a wonderful collaborative effort. Once this idea was on the table, the group started gathering input from, again, a very diverse Gender and Resilience Working Group. That was in early 2017, just about, is this useful? How might it be used? Just getting some initial thoughts. And then in April 2017, a small group of us met to sort of hash out these potential elements. That included Mercy Corps, CARE, Save the Children, and 2 of us from the TOPS program. And we we came to some key agreements, I guess, at that meeting. One was, why do we need it? Another one was sort of, what are we going to create? And then we had some ideas about how it might be used. Why we need it. The objective of this framework is to link the gender and resilience communities of practice, both of whom are mostly conducting separate streams of implementation, separate streams of measurement, separate streams of analysis. So we wanted this framework to provoke thought among these two groups and inform both groups about the nexus between the two communities of practice. We also wanted the framework to serve as a tool that could help the general development community be more aware of gender impact on resilience and vice versa. We wanted it to stimulate thought on improving methodologies, improving implementation approaches, specifically gender transformative approaches. Again, in April 2017, what will we create? What is this going to look like? We reviewed many diverse existing resilience frameworks and some gender frameworks for common components and also some very distinct components so that we could identify the must-haves, the non-negotiables in this framework. And the panel will describe more about each component shortly. We had some back and forth, I guess. Will we create a conceptual framework or an analytical framework? We agreed on a conceptual framework, but we decided we wanted to keep it general enough to appeal to a broad audience who could then apply it to their own existing framework, and that includes any analytical frameworks out there. And that kind of ties into how we thought the framework might be used. We've been consistent in our feeling from the beginning that the purpose is to complement, not replace, organizations' individual frameworks. And it will complement it by highlighting these key considerations regarding the integration of gender and resilience. So it's a value add to existing frameworks. I like to think of it as an overlay or a companion tool. And again, we thought that the framework might promote collaboration because many organizations are developing similar frameworks and are thinking about the nexus between these two streams of analysis. So that, I guess, I think of that as like the first trimester. And then we, took the output from that meeting and brought it back to the larger gender and resilience group. Put some key framing questions out there. We've got some case examples about what are shocks for men, women, different age groups. What are the impacts of shocks and stressors on the gender domains, and how do the gender norms influence capacities and so forth. So we got input to these questions. We also, the larger groups helped to determine the clearest and most relevant way to frame the gender domains. There was a lot of discussion. New players came in, particularly Caitlin Nordham of Cultural Practice and Angela Ospina, to determine how we could visually present the framework so that we encompass these critical elements and their relationships to one another. Again, always keeping in mind that the goal is to inform other resilience frameworks, not replace them. One kind of key decision that came about at this time was in the beginning we thought we might include caste, disability status, other forms of social exclusion or inclusion. And we decided not to include that because the scope was just too broad to adequately do it justice. So the gender and resilience framework remains focused just on gender. That takes us to, I guess, late 2017, and there were many iterations of the framework. A lot of folks pitching in, as both Christie's mentioned. So after a few iterations, the group has arrived at the version shared with you today. And on that note, I'm going to turn it over to the panel to talk a little bit about the version that we're looking at today. Thank you.
Thank you, Laurie. Audrey, I think, are you going to give us a bit of an introduction of the framework?
We'll absolutely do that. I'm going to
wave bye to Lori, and if we could flip.
Okay, bye.
Thanks, Lori.
Sure.
And I'll begin up because I like to point at things while I'm talking. And while we're switching to this, which you guys all should have on your table as well, how many of you are from an organization that has a framework or an approach to resilience that is essentially owned or used by that organization? Yeah, I see a number of hands from different organizations. And so as Lori mentioned, when we were going through the process of developing this, we looked at a number of different resilience frameworks, probably many of yours, and we're pulling out core elements from these frameworks so that we could be sure that, as she mentioned, that this framework complements the existing frameworks that are out there and doesn't try to replace them, because we all know that's not possible or reasonable anyway. And so where we arrived at this, I also, Lori mentioned Kay Norday, who's in the back here. She had a lot to do with pulling together this structure for us, which with lots of different people in the room finally pulled together a framework that we all said, yeah, I think that might be it. Yeah. And so we start in the middle. We've got gender domains in the middle here because this is the center and the focus of the framework. And we have cultural norms, we have agency, decision-making, relations, structures, policies, and then roles and responsibilities. And there's a number of different ways that organizations define gender domains or gender norms, and we had a list, probably 6 or 8 of them from different organizations, went back and forth for a while. And we settled on this one, but these could, of course, be shifted around. You may have gender-based violence be its own separate domain of consideration as opposed to included under relations, for example. But we felt that this encompassed all of the domains that were at least scattered around different organizations. And then we've got dots that are coming out from here because although these connect visually to a few different elements, we wanted to make it clear that these are impacting every different aspect of the framework. And so many of these elements will look familiar to you as they come from resilience frameworks. We start with shocks and stressors, natural disasters, man-made disasters, unexpected elements that would disrupt the development trajectory. And they can impact at multiple levels of aggregation, so not just individuals, but also households, communities, and systems. So define what actually happens, so how these different systems, communities, and people respond in the face of a shock or stress. And these are all impacted by the gender domains at the center. So they impact the vulnerabilities and capacities. They impact how shocks and stresses are perceived and are felt. Oftentimes, shocks and stresses themselves can disrupt or shift gender norms in a very stark way. We see that happen in a lot of different cases, even in the case of the World War II here, when you could see the shift in women's roles within U.S. society with the shock hit. And this depends on what these gender domains that influence the vulnerabilities and capacities will influence whether or not these household systems will recover or collapse in the face of this shock or stress. So these are central to the whole process. And then this is not a static process either. We wanted to make it very clear that this is not something that just happens once, but this is part of an ongoing process. We have recurrent shocks and stresses that these different systems are facing. And so whether or not a household, a system, a community is able to recover or collapse will then feed right back into the same process over and over. And so this continues happening with new shocks, new stressors, and these same gender domains are influencing each aspect of it. So I'll pause there, and we're going to dig into the details a little bit. But that's just a big picture overview of how this all came together. One more thing to mention, we have the background here that is a map that is not just to be pretty, although there's a nice little display to it, but also we wanted to visualize that these shocks and stressors, this whole process is happening within very specific geographic locations, ecological contexts, and environments, and that has a huge impact as well on what's actually happening in the face of these shocks and stresses.
So let's start with a couple questions that we've put together for the panel, and you can grab a question. But I wonder if you could talk a little bit about your experience in seeing the different domains of the framework interact with each other. What does that look like to you? What's your experience been? Maybe you could give some examples of, kind of how all of this is actually working.
Okay. Just thinking about it, you know, in terms of, you know, from my perspective, I think the framework really enables one to look at a situation of vulnerability or resilience through a lens which brings in all of the elements related to gender.